Welcome to the third and final video discussing the book Behaviour by Robert Sapolski. We will review chapters 9 through 11. Then I'll have a couple of slides about additional concepts discussed in the book. We now go back in time to the fertilized egg. In pop culture, genes are almost synonymous with determinism. Although certain genes do determine our hair color, skin color, but most personal traits are not caused by genes, but are merely influenced by them. The best way to understand the relationship between amino acids, genes, and chromosomes, which are the main components of the human genetics or our DNA, is thinking of them as the letters, words, and books in a certain language. In the human genetics language, we only have 4 letters, and they always come in pairs. The letter A is always paired with the letter T, and the letter G is always paired with the letter C. Those pairs form steps in a spiral double helix staircase or DNA, as shown in the image. The words of this language or genes are formed by the sequence that the steps of the ladder or DNA are arranged in. For example, a sequence of gene made up of the letter A, T, 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 G might instruct for blue eyes, while a sequence or gene made up of the letters T, 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 G might instruct for brown eyes. Now, imagine we're writing words on a scroll. They have to be written in certain sequence to make sense. Similarly, genes in a ladder or DNA have to be arranged in a particular sequence, and each gene has a particular location called its locus. If we are writing on a scroll, we wrap the scroll for easier storage. The same way, hundreds of thousands of genes in a long sequence of DNA are wrapped to form a chromosome. We all have 46 chromosomes that are paired together into 23 pairs. There are 22 pairs of non-sex chromosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosome. Pairs of non-sex chromosomes are identical in size, shape, and position and number of genes. The pair of sex chromosomes, which determine whether a fetus becomes male or female, are not identical. Except for certain special cells, for example, the sperm, the egg, or red blood cells, the nucleus of every normal human cell contains the 23 pairs of chromosomes. When an egg is fertilized by a sperm, 1 chromosome from the mother pairs with another one from the father. If the gene that affects a certain trait, let's say the color of the eyes, are different in the parents, for example, if the chromosome from the father is for blue eyes and the chromosome from the mother is for brown eyes, then the brown eyes gene is going to prevail in the child. So as the image suggests, genes do influence the colors of our eyes, our hair, and how tall or short we are, and also our susceptibility to certain diseases. Yet, genes don't really determine much more than that. This is because genes themselves are affected by the environment we live in. For example, if someone has a certain gene which is responsible for depression, this can increase the risk of depression, but only in people who experienced childhood adversity. Let's look at patterns of cultural variations as they pertain to the best and worst of our behaviors. We'll explore how different types of brains produce different cultures, and different types of culture produce different brains. In other words, how culture and biology co-evolve. So if we asked ourselves, what is culture? A good answer would be, it's that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired as a member of a society. Another good answer might be it's how we do and think about things, transmitted by non genetic means. Well, by now, I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing me talk about the frontal cortex. But bear with me one last time, and I promise I'll never mention it again. The delay in maturation of the frontal cortex is the main factor that allows it to be freer from the control of genes, much more than the other brain regions. So the frontal cortex can be shaped or influenced instead by the environment. This allows us to soak up and fully absorb cultural norms. That's why, in a family of immigrants who leave their country and culture and go to a new society and a different culture, kids in this family with an immature frontal cortex are able to adapt to the new culture much easier than their parents, who have a developed frontal cortex. Please allow me to add a disclaimer here. You won't find this example in the book, as I made it up, but I thought it explains the point in a much easier way than the examples included in the book. So if this example turns out to be false, please don't blame Sapolski. So that's why it's safe to say the culture influences the brain. And as changes happen to the brain, brains in turn influence cultures. Well, I'm actually enjoying contributing to the ideas in the book and not just summarizing them. So here is another example that I made up. Let's take slavery, for instance. It was culturally accepted for hundreds of years. Then, for a small group of people, they rejected this culture as they saw how wrong it was. Here, culture changed their brains. So those early abolitionists wrote against slavery in newspapers and in books to spread awareness. And with time, people changed. Thus, brains did change the culture. Oh, and I know I've promised not to mention the frontal cortex ever again, but for the last time, allow me to say that frontal cortex delayed maturation is a huge factor in how we can explain culture differences. Since I'm sure you all know the typical concepts of culture, allow me to talk to you about two very interesting types of culture that come to us from the animal kingdom. Have you ever noticed that in some animal species, males and females are very similar in size and appearance? Look at those two swans. We can't really tell male from female because the differences are minimal. The culture of such species is called pair bonding culture. Aren't they really cute? Although I'm kind of upset with them, as they might be the ones who started this craze of making heart signs for pictures. Anyways, we also have other species where there is a large difference in size between sexes. This phenomena is called sexual dimorphism. And the more sexually dimorphic a primate species is physically, the more likely their culture is a tournament culture. So, in a pair bonding species, the strategy of the female is about choosing a father who will help raise the kids. And typically, males don't get into fights because every male is going to have one mate for life. In a tournament species, the males intimidate and fight each other for mating rights. So only the largest and strongest male ends up mating with all the females. At the same time, the females are looking for the best genes, so they choose the male who appears fittest and healthiest. In this table, we can see some other attributes of both cultures. This brings us to an obvious but sensitive question. Are humans a pair bonding or tournament species? Well, on one hand, in almost all human societies, most people get married. On the other hand, most human societies throughout history have tolerated polygamy and behaviors like divorce, promiscuity, cheating, and jealousy. Looking at human physical differences between the sexes, men are about 10% taller and 20% heavier than women. This suggests that we're not totally a pair bonding species, but the difference is also not large enough to make us a tournament species either. So humans are somewhere in between. And maybe that explains why so many of us are confused and conflicted when it comes to mating, relationships, and marriage. We finally reached the end of our journey, or the beginning of it all. We now reached population and species attributes. An example of evolution is what we think happened with the giraffes. There might have been a drought at some time, so giraffes with longer necks survived better because they could reach leaves on high tree branches. With time, the population attributes of the following generations changed and the whole species had long necks. Naturally, and since we're talking about evolution, you'd expect us to talk about this man, Charles Darwin. But allow me to diverge from the book and to talk about this woman instead, Nina Jabolinski. In her extremely interesting and informative TED Talk, Nina tells us the following. In his most famous work, The Origin of Species, published in 1859, Darwin wrote just one line about the evolution of humans. It was 12 years later when he published The Descent of Man, where he offered a detailed discussion of man's descent from ape-like ancestors, as well as the link between sexual selection and human race. But when it came to skin color, and although he saw lightly pigmented people close to the pole and darkly pigmented people close to the equator, yet Darwin did not think that the difference in skin color coincided or had anything to do with the climate that people lived in. So what Nina shows in her talk is that thanks to ultraviolet satellite images published by NASA, is that the area in pinks and reds indicate high ultraviolet rays at the Earth's surface, and those in gray indicate the lowest exposure to ultraviolet rays. Then she reminded us that our earliest human ancestors have originated in Africa, where the highest UVR exposure is. So, through a process of evolution, melanin was produced in high quantities in their skin as a perfect sunscreen to protect those ancestors from the harmful type of UVR rays that could damage their DNA. She added that when our ancestors started to migrate north to areas that had low UVR exposure, closer to the pole, the amount of melanin in their skin gradually went down as no protection was needed. Actually, any protection was harmful as it would block out the small amount of UVR rays needed to produce enough vitamin D. If this subject is of interest to you, please watch Nina Jabolinski's videos on YouTube. This ends our journey back in time to discover and learn about the different nature and nurture factors that influence the human behavior. There are 7 more chapters in the book, but I won't be covering them as they are more or less an expansion on the ideas that we already discussed in the previous chapters. I'll just say a word or two about each chapter so you can decide whether or not to read them in the book. Us versus Them asks if there is hope that humans can vanquish the tendency to see others through the lens of xenophobia and conflict. Hierarchy, Obedience, and Resistance expands on the previous idea and asks if we can ever eliminate hierarchies within the same group. Here, Sapolski is wondering, when it comes to moral decision making, When is it better to rely on intuition and when on reasoning? Here, the discussion is about empathy. Next, he talks about horrendous actions done in the name of religion. And here he gives some examples of how things that have nothing to do with the law can influence the judgment of judges. For example, whether or not they had lunch before giving a certain verdict. And finally, in the last chapter, Sapolski is trying to paint an optimistic picture of the future, saying things have improved. One subject that Sapolsky discusses in the chapter about criminal justice is the idea of free will. He says, when it comes to free will, there are three ways of viewing the place of biology in making sense of our behaviors, criminal or otherwise. We have complete free will in our behavior, we have none, or we're somewhere in between. Sapolsky's answer to the above question is that free will moves to the forefront with decisions that are slow and deliberate, whereas biological factors may push free will aside in split-second decision situations. One of my favorite examples that Sapolsky gives about how we can actually change our societies into better ones is that of the baboon tribe that he monitored for many years in Africa. Here we go. Let's listen together.
The thing that has most impacted me of my 33 years of hanging with baboons in the Serengeti, not only was it the case that if you were a more than averagely aggressive male, you died from this tainted meat, but in addition, if you were socially disconnected, you were aggressive and you were willing to give up all the social connectedness to go to do this. So it killed half the males in the troop. And what you were left with was twice as many females as males, which was very atypical in the baboon world. And the guys who were there were nice guys. They got into fights, but they didn't beat up on somebody smaller as much after they lost the fight. They were more socially affiliative. They spent more time grooming. They actually groomed a female back for a few minutes after she groomed him for an hour. This is like a prince of a baboon you want to take home to mom to meet kind of thing. And what you saw was the entire culture of this troop changed. They became more peaceful. They became more socially affiliative. They sat closer to each other. They had less fighting. They had lower stress hormone levels. Their immune systems worked better, which was the stuff I was mostly studying.
Wow. Did you all hear what Sapolsky just said? He just gave us women a fail-free recipe for a peaceful and loving society with no aggression or wars. Who wouldn't want that? And the price to pay is minimal. Just kill all the alpha males in the society. And by the way, I can come up with a long list in no time. Okay, guys, don't be scared. I'm just kidding. Or am I? Alright, I'd better end this before things get tricky. So, a few things to remember are our physical body does affect our brains. Our brain, in turn, also affects our bodies. Individuals, no more exceptional than the rest of us, provide stunning examples of our finest moments as humans. And finally, if you had to boil this book down to a single phrase, it would be, it's complicated. Thank you so much for watching those 3 videos with me, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I enjoyed preparing them for you. Bye now.